and then we'll make a start. Okay, welcome everyone. Good evening. My name is Tabea. I'm from the Manchester Confucius Institute, and tonight we're holding one of our online talks. We are pleased to introduce you to Richard Green, who's joining us from Scotland. He's a member of the Scottish Rock Garden Club, and this evening he's going to take us on a virtual trip to China. He traveled to the mountain areas southwest of China, I believe before the pandemic, and in the to explore the plants and flowers in the area, and he's going to share a vast array of pictures and stories with us this evening. Really pleased to welcome you, Richard. Thank you for taking the time to prepare for this talk and join us and to give us that insight. That's fantastic. A couple of things in terms of housekeeping. We are recording this talk and are planning on publishing it on our YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be seen, please switch off your camera. I would also like to ask you to mute yourself so there's very little disruption. And we're hoping that there'll be some time at the end for questions. If you do have any questions, please put them in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function at the end if you want to talk directly to Richard. That's no problem. And yes, I think that's all from me. Ready to hand over now. Please join me in welcoming Richard Green. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Tabea. It's good to see so many people here this evening. And as Tabea said, I'm going to talk to you about a visit I did to the southwest of China, to Sichuan and Yunnan. I'll just share my screen. Sorry, I'm just juggling screens here. Just give me a moment. Right, there we go. Tabea, is that okay? Can you see the first screen there?
Yes, that's perfect. Great.
Good, good. Okay, well, as I say, this is a whistle-stop tour of the Sichuan and Yunnan provinces in the southwest of China. Just to give you some background quickly, I'm a member of the Scottish Rock Garden Club, which specializes in alpine rock garden plants and so forth. Although we're not specialists, and we're not entirely specialists in that, we do have normal gardens, as you might put it. This trip I did was under the auspices of the Alpine Garden Society. This is the organization in England and Wales, mainly, and they organize trips abroad to various places to allow participants to see plants in their natural habitats. So I went on this trip, luckily in June 2019, just before the lockdown started. And I've been thinking about it ever since because it's the most amazing place to go, and hopefully I'll be able to show you a fair number of the interesting plants that we saw, as well as some of the scenery whilst we take a trip through these provinces. So firstly, where did we go? This picture you'll probably recognize as being China, with the other countries to the left. The purple line is shows you approximately where we were. So we were in the far west of China. We started off in the green splodge, which is Chengdu, the city of Chengdu, and then we went in a westerly and a southwesterly direction dodging in and out of valleys and going over the passes to see some of the really exciting plants of the area. So looking at that in a little bit more detail, here is a larger map of the area that we went along. So we started in the top right-hand corner in Chengdu. We went across through some of the mountains. You can see the white splodges being the tops of the mountains with snow on them. And we went gradually south and west, almost as far as the border with Tibet, and then down further south through Yunnan, down to Kangding, through past Kangding, down to Shangri-La, and then west as far as Dechen. And then we came back and flew back from Chengdu to London again. So Chengdu is an extremely large city. I think there's about 16 million population in the city. It's a typical Chinese city with a fair number of high-rise flats. But even as we were going from the airport into the center to our hotel for the night, we saw some trees by the side of the motorway. And these attracted our attention because these are ginkgo biloba trees. These were discovered, shall I say, as a living fossil, and they're now grown in huge nurseries outside Chengdu and planted as street trees. So that was really our first interesting plant of the trip, and that was only a few minutes out from the airport. The next day, having spent the night in the airport just to allow for any possible problems with luggage and to and anybody else who perhaps didn't arrive on time, we went up into the mountains and gradually acclimatized. So we stopped off at the obligatory panda reserve. So here is a panda doing what they normally do, which is eat bamboo. Outside is rather natty looking concrete house. And there were plenty of other pandas in this reserve. There's quite a lot of little ones. They do very well at breeding them. Here was a little panda who seemed to have fallen asleep up a tree. But we were after the plants, so we carried on in a bit more speed out towards the west. Here is the bus that we were traveling in. And it wasn't long before we started seeing the mountains in the afternoon of our first day. So we got out and started to take photographs. The tourists went to take photographs of the mountains, and we instead turned around and walked up the side of the verge. And really the first of these interesting plants that we saw was this lily. This is only quite small, only about 6 inches high, but it's a very, very nice little lily, which you can grow in this country, and is quite a rare one. I'm not sure whether you have been on one of these sort of trips, but normally if you went on a bus journey, you'd go from A to B and then get pushed out and go and see a tourist site and then move on. But the Alpine Garden Society trips are not like that at all. If everybody's looking out of the bus windows, obviously, and if you see an interesting plant, you simply shout stop. And generally speaking, the bus shudders to a halt and you will pile out and run off back up the road to see what you can find. In this case, here was us scrambling up the side of the road, and you'll see a purple looking plant in the undergrowth there, which was in fact an incarvilia. But these were plants which you could grow in your garden in Britain quite happily. But it was nice to see them just straight from the bus. Now, when we were scratching around looking for these plants, we found one or two other ones, and this was one of the must-see plants of a trip to China. Cypripediums are orchids, and these ones are really rather nice, and you can in fact grow them in this country. When you see them in the wild, they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. Even this particular species, you get dark ones as well as light ones. This is a rather nice dark one. But I mean, they can be grown quite happily in this country. And if you have the right sort of conditions, a nice woodsy, damp soil, you can grow these sort of plants. This is a cultivated one, which is growing in a garden in Scotland. However, we moved on, and by the time, the way these trips work, you simply go up the passes, and you generally stop at the top of the passes because quite often there's some interesting plants to see at the top. Now, anybody who knows their rarer plants, we'll see several in this picture of interest. There's big yellow primrosy splodges, which are meconopsis. There's some little red spots in there, and there's a pink one and a purple one and a couple of yellow ones. So there's a whole selection of primulas and meconopsis, which are poppies. And if we look a bit closer, this was one of the ones which anybody with a nice damp garden in Britain, I live in the west of Scotland, so I'm able to grow these plants fairly well, but it was absolutely wonderful to see them in the wild. One of the other must-see plants, which are quite difficult to grow in this country, are the meconopsis punicea. This is the red-looking poppy in the center here with the petals that hang down. They are absolutely wonderful when you look at them close up. This is one of them just coming out of bud, and the petals are all they have been described as like crimped silk as they push out of the buds, and then of course they gradually unfurl and get larger, and eventually there they are hanging down. Presumably they're hanging down in order to allow the flies, you'll see one in the center of that flower, and yet avoid the rain washing all the pollen out. There are plenty of other meconopsis growing in the area. This was a rather nice yellow one, which everybody wants to see. That was on my tick list. These are actually also growable in this country. To bring you completely up to date, this is a picture that was taken yesterday at the Harrogate Flower Show, which is not far away from you in Manchester. And you'll see some of these meconopsis growing in there. Now, this is a trade stand of one of the specialist nurseries. And a lot of these corydalis in the center, there's a blue flower that's a corydalis, and some of these meconopsis, and there's a blue one on the right-hand side, and primulas in the front. These are all plants which are quite growable in this country. You might need to look after them fairly carefully, but we were there to see them in the wild. Now, the roads in China are really a story which would take up probably a full lecture. But we were well aware that our guide had discovered that this road was being resurfaced and was actually going to be closed for more or less the whole day. So as we pressed westwards, you'll see our bus, 2 or 3 lorries ahead there. We simply stopped in the road there, and we knew the road was going to be closed for another 2 hours. So everybody queued up and just sat in their lorries. All the botanists amongst us, of course, simply clambered out of our bus and went off the left hand and the right hand side of the road and went looking for plants. So on the left hand side there was a fairly steep dip down to the river, and we were able to get across one of these rather rickety looking bridges here. There was one of the members of our party going across with their hands out, hoping not to fall into the torrent below. And there are prayer flags on the other side. Sorry, wrong way. We did see 1 or 2 interesting plants on the other side here. This one is growable in this country, but it grows off a tap root, and you have to get fresh seed in order to grow it. You can't divide the plant. So this is really a very specialist one. But it's a very nice flower. The plants are not all difficult to grow. In fact, it was very nice for us to see things like this clematis, which you can buy in any garden centre in the UK. But these were actually growing in the wild and just scrambling up roadside shrubs. Likewise, here is a spirea, which is also a sort of shrub that you can buy quite happily in a garden centre just down the road. But the thing is that these plants were introduced into the West and into the UK by the plant hunters in between 1850 and 1950, say, and this is why we have them in our gardens, because people went out searching for them. Lower down in amongst the damper areas, there's a nice little primula here, which is quite growable in this country, and that's very nice when you get close up to it. We did discover how the best way to grow these in this country is obviously to have a supply of fertilizer, but it might be a bit tricky to get the fertilizer from the yaks, which obviously do their droppings around, and that's one of the reasons why these primulas grow very well in the damp yak meadows. This one was looking at us slightly askance, but luckily it was being looked after by its owners, just by the side of the road there. Well, after we'd reached our next hotel, we came back off in the evening. You'll see the clouds are gathering there, just to have a search around. And it's amazing when you search around, you just jump out of the bus. The road is on the left-hand side there. We'd parked our bus in a lay-by. We found quite a number of interesting plants just in this meadow between the road and the river. One of the plants which is a nice one to grow in your garden here in the UK is an inconvenience. I haven't put a species to this one because there are a fair number of different types of inconvenience, and it's quite difficult to tell them apart. But they have lovely large flowers. I mean, that's my size of my hand next to it. And in amongst the rocks, there's this rather nice little corydalis with yellow flowers and some rather nice leaves. There's a very wide selection of these sorts of plants growing in China. Also, for those of you that have climbed the hills in England as well as in Scotland, you'll see pedicularis, purple ones, but there's only one growing in this country. In China, there are dozens, and I'll sprinkle through this talk one or two more of these. Now we got up to the top of one of the passes, and this looks like an idyllic view of the mountains with lots of yellow meconopsis in the front here and rhododendrons, shrubs all the way up the side of the mountains. But we're not very far away from civilization here. This was looking in one direction. If I turn in the other direction, this is the car park and the visitor center and the shrines at the Zhejiu Pass. So this was really the first of the large passes that we went to. But it's not very difficult to get away from the crowds and to just walk up the hill, and you then find a veritable carpet of interesting plants. Now, it would be wonderful to be able to emulate this and grow it in our gardens here in Britain, but I think that would not be possible. I've tried to count the number of different species of flowers here, but there are really quite a large number, including some blue meconopsis poppies there. There's some called androsace, and there's a whole load of plants here, most of which are on their own growable if you have the right conditions in this country. Usually rock garden conditions, so something with fairly gritty soil and not soggy or clayey. And you can do that by adding grit to your soil. If we get closer down to see these, I mean, this is a little meconopsis here. The flower is probably about 2 inches in diameter here. And growing amongst them, there are other things. I mean, this is yet another pedicularis. They seem to come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and colors, for that matter. But this was probably my most favorite plant of the whole trip. The other sorts of meconopsis that you can pedicularis that you can see further up the mountains. This one's a particularly yellow one with some nice brown ends to its flowers. But we'd gone to the Zhejiu Pass to see one of the specialities of the area. And this is us scrambling around in amongst the rhododendrons, trying to find a black primula. When the plant hunters came back 100 years ago saying they'd found a black primula, nobody believed them. But in fact, there is. And if you look really carefully, this is the point at which I normally do a pub quiz round, and you have to spot the black primula in this photograph. As there are one or two other plants, you'll probably not manage it, but if you can see my cursor in the center here, I'm circling the flower just here, just now. But the easiest thing to do is to wait until it gets a little bit more misty, and then you can see these things sticking up. And in the center of the picture there's one or two of these black primulas. When you get up really close to them, they are really black. However, we moved on. Now, the Chinese have done a huge amount of road engineering, and most of the passes have now got tunnels through them, underneath them. And that leaves the old road over the top of the pass to be, well, left to the vagaries of nature. And you'll see the left-hand side here, all the scree is gradually coming down and spreading over the road. This was our driver and leader looking off up the road, wondering whether or not we'd get to the top. We pressed on, luckily, and the driver said that he thought he could jump out and clear any rocks that might be in the middle of the road. And sure enough, we did get to the top of the pass here. But it had obviously not been travelled over by many buses recently, possibly cars or jeeps. But this is our driver who had to climb out of the top in order to disentangle the prayer flags that got caught on our air conditioning. We'll move on now to one day we spent near Kangding, and this is the Grey Lake. To those of you that have been in Scotland, this looks like any normal day on a Scottish hill, apart from the fact that there's a rather nice rhododendron growing out of the top of a rock. This lake had plenty of other interesting flowers. There's more of the yellow meconopsis. There's a primula we came to see. This is a really exciting primula because it's to a botanist or to a gardener, because the flowers are very different from normal primulas. The petals are swept right backwards. And this is it, just for still the drops of mist from overnight, because we were there fairly early in the morning. If we move on through the rhododendron scrub, we can see these plants, Cassiopeas. They look rather like whipcords, but they've got lovely flowers on them. And these are a favourite of those of you in the UK who have got dampish gardens. They grow quite happily, blue rhododendron bushes in a garden, a sort of peaty soil with moss. There are plenty of other interesting plants that we saw around the lake here. Primulas, Primula secundiflora is the purple one here, and there's a type of rhubarb in the background there. This is a smallish one, but the white stem with flowers is just coming up. And there was a very nice corydalis in amongst those. These are growable in this country, and there are some seeds going around in the specialist societies who have seed exchanges. So that was really a good day. This was above Kangding, as I said, and Kangding was one of the provincial centres, headquarters, and was well known by the British and other plant hunters who went out in the late 1800s, 1900s. In the middle of this valley, it probably didn't look like this in those days, but it's got a rushing glacial torrent down through the centre of it, and is the buildings are growing up the side. We did get the opportunity here to go to the market and found, for botanists, one or two interesting things. Here is some gentian flowers, which I think are used for tea. Somebody who can perhaps translate the Chinese for me later on. There was another one out here. These, I think, are fritillary bulbs. I'm hoping that these were cultivated fritillary bulbs rather than being pulled out in the wild. But there are quite a lot of collections going on for both for medicinal and for just eating. But the Grey Lake itself, when we got to it, we spent a whole day walking up from the lake itself, up through where the cloud is, and up almost as far as the glacier up the top there, in between the two sets of mountains. We got quite a long way up into the screes, and it's interesting that some of the plants here look like ones from other parts of the world with mountains. This one is quite a rare plant that only grows really high in the screes in the alpine zone. But there are other plants. If you go to the Alps, there's one called Erytricium that looks very much the same. And in the South Island of New Zealand, there's a forget-me-not, which looks almost the same yet again. So it's interesting how quite a lot of these plants have grown to their conditions and end up looking very much the same. Up there also one or two more interesting of the blue poppies. This one actually we thought was something quite different, but turns out to be a fairly newly described species. And here it is growing in pure scree, effectively, with its roots down in amongst the rocks. These sort of plants are growable in this country, but they do need specialists looking after. Anyway, our travels continued. The saga of road conditions continues. Here is a case where I think the road has been covered by a landslide. We had to stop here. And as the door opened, all the botanists jumped out of the car and spread around into the surrounding fields and forests and so forth. And it was interesting for us to see this field, which was very well manured, and was full of this arum lily. You'll see in the front left of the picture here, this hooded arum lily, and there's a larger picture of it. Very nice plant. They're growable quite happily in this country. You can get bulbs from the specialist nurseries. Outside the edge of the field, there was some quite large shrubs. This is called a mock orange, and is quite available in the British garden centres, as are these peonies. But it was wonderful to see these plants actually just growing in the wild where they had originally come from. This very nice rose was growing down by the side of the river. In fact, this is it backlit. The new thorns are very large and brightly coloured. On the strength of seeing this in the wild, I was able to get one from a nursery in the UK, and it's now growing quite happily in my garden and looking very much the same as it did there. One of the other plants that you'll see in quite a lot of probably urban plantings in the UK are the white-stemmed birch trees. But here it is, betula growing in the wild here, with the clematis growing up it. And in the ground underneath, there was some more. These are Cypripedium orchids, a different sort of Cypripedium orchid. Again, these are all plants that you can grow in this country, and they have been available from specialist suppliers. Most interesting little flower there. And in the roadside, there were big bushes of a sort of honeysuckle. And this is a shrubby honeysuckle rather than the climbing one. So by this time, we were heading to the far west, and we went to a place called Litang, which is right up on the plateau. And this was about the furthest up we got. We're about here 13,000 feet, which is about 4,000 meters above sea level. And the hotel that we stayed in is the only one I've ever stayed in that's actually had a white-coated doctor on hand in the hotel foyer in case people got breathless or had heart problems. And the rooms all had oxygen laid on. It appears that some holiday makers simply drive straight up from sea level, or fly straight up from sea level to this sort of level, and then have problems with their breathing. Because we'd travelled up gradually, we didn't seem to have these problems. But Litang has got one of these wonderful monasteries with gold roofs, and this was us spending a morning doing some actual sightseeing, and we looked around the monastery, all of which was completely covered with all this painting in gold and red and different colours. So having spent a morning doing our sightseeing, we moved out into the yak fields, or on the outside. We come particularly to see this yellow androsace. This had been discovered by a trip in the early 1990s. And again, when people came back and said, these plants are normally pink, you remember the pink one I showed you on top of the Zaidu Shan earlier on? Well, these ones were yellow, and nobody had seen a yellow one until they came back saying so. So since then, everybody has piled out of their buses at this yak field in order to see it. We moved on, and in the rocks, there were a fair number of these primulas. It's always quite exciting when you find a new plant, because you give a shout and everybody then comes scrambling across the countryside and starts looking for bigger, better ones. But these primulas were all growing in between these very large granite boulders. And in the fields round about them, there was another Particularis. This one's a yellow one. which is quite a surprise to those of us that are only used to seeing the purple ones in this country. Now, it was at this point in our trip that we left our blue tourist bus and transferred into four-wheel drive Jeeps in order to do a trip up into some of the surrounding mountains. Now, it did seem a little bit of an unnecessary luxury given the roads we've been driving on, but we all popped into our four-wheel drives and carried on